The summer of 1943 brought the largest armored confrontation the world had yet seen. Along the vast plains of western Russia, tens of thousands of soldiers faced one another amid fields of dust, smoke, and steel. The Battle of Kursk became a turning point often remembered in broad statistics and sweeping claims, but the lived experience was different. Black and white images from that era show crowded train platforms where civilians stood with quiet uncertainty, and close-up portraits of young men in plain uniforms who seemed both weary and resolved. Mid-shots of stamped memoranda and folded reports suggest that planning was hurried, sometimes inconsistent, and not always aligned with the official story. Public accounts frame the engagement as a decisive military clash, yet archival fragments hint that it may also have been driven by other motives, including industrial display or political demonstration. The atmosphere was not only one of battlefield confrontation, but also of paperwork, secrecy, and selective communication. The files that survive carry anomalies such as dates that do not match events or reference numbers changed in later margins. These subtle discrepancies invite closer scrutiny, suggesting that the battle was not only fought in fields, but also in archives and memory. The black and white frames leave us with the impression of scale, uncertainty, and human strain. This program does not aim to resolve every debate, but to trace the lines between what was declared and what remains ambiguous. We begin with the shadows over the Eastern Plain. Chapter 1. Shadows over the Eastern Plain. In the summer of 1943, the plains of Western Russia became a vast stage for machines and men. The horizon stretched empty, except for low clouds and dust that clung to the ground. Trains delivered supplies and soldiers to remote platforms where civilians gathered in plain coats, watching silently as convoys passed. Black and white photographs from this period show close-up portraits of young conscripts in worn uniforms, their eyes fixed on something far away. Wide shots reveal columns of armored vehicles moving in formation, kicking up smoke and soil. These images suggest immense preparation, yet they also hint at uncertainty. Official accounts describe the clash as essential, a necessary strike designed to change the course of the war. Other readings suggest it may have been as much about displaying industrial power as achieving tactical advantage. Evidence of this duality appears in surviving paperwork. One folded memorandum bears a stamped date that does not align with the sequence of events it describes. Another document contains reference numbers that were later altered, raising questions about the clarity of record-keeping. Such indicators do not disprove official claims, but they remind us that history often emerges from contested paperwork as much as from battlefields. In the photographs, weary faces lean against steel hulls while clerks in distant offices sort through stacks of files. The juxtaposition of human endurance and bureaucratic effort frames the opening of the battle. It also raises questions about what the true goals may have been. Was this campaign purely about military necessity, or did it carry other signals, meant for allies and rivals alike? The monotone imagery of train stations, blurred crowds, and darkened offices suggests layers of meaning behind the public narrative. The reality of the Eastern Plain was both visible and obscured, a setting where declarations met the slow weight of documentation. To understand this tension, we must look more closely at the paper trails that survive, and how shifting accounts began to shape the story before the fighting had even ended. Chapter 2. Paper Trails and Shifting Accounts. Inside dim offices, clerks bent over ledgers and folding machines, sorting stacks of reports. The light was low, and the air smelled faintly of oil and paper. Men in plain uniforms stood in doorways, glancing at folded memoranda passed between desks. Outside, train platforms were busy with men and materiel moving under guarded schedules. Photographs show mid-shots of tables heaped with files and close-ups of hands marking dates. The records created in those rooms did not always march in perfect sequence. Some pages carry a file stamp that appears out of step with its surrounding entries. Other pages show reference numbers altered later in darker ink. These anomalies may suggest corrections made under pressure, or they might indicate deliberate reshaping of an administrative record. Either way, the papers became as important as the routes that led to the front. Clerks recorded orders, and staff officers read them aloud at long tables. The act of copying, annotating, and recirculating created multiple versions of the same ledger. A folded memorandum might travel across departments, accruing marginal notes and brief initials. Those marginal notes sometimes change emphasis or redirect responsibility. A single docket entry could be refiled with a different header, and the meaning shifts as a result. Observers later compared duplicates and found mismatches in their stamped dates and sequence. Such inconsistencies could reflect haste during crisis or a more purposeful alignment of record with rhetoric. The visual motif of a worn uniform lapel is present throughout these papers, in portraits clipped to reports and pasted into archives. That recurring image binds human presence to administrative action. People appear in plain coats in platform scenes, waiting for news that often came in typed form. The balance between field reports and office summaries seems unstable in several surviving collections. In some archives, mid-shots of folded documents rest beside printed communiques that contradict parts of those files. Those contradictions may have led committees to issue revised accounts later. When historians attempt to read the trail, they frequently encounter pages with later hand edits. Those edits sometimes add or delete phrases that affect interpretation. One set of files contains a ledger with a stamped date inconsistent with an attached narrative. Another series shows reference numbers shifted in margin notes, as if reclassified after the fact. These two types of indicators raise questions about authorship and timing. They do not resolve intent, however, and they do not reveal every answer. At the human level, the papers mattered because they affected rations, rotations, and the movement of families. A clerk's alteration could delay supply trains or reroute internal dispatches, and that consequence influenced lives far from the SAO offices. In black and white photographs, we see postal workers handling bundles and soldiers clutching envelopes. The documents traveled on the same platforms that bore troops. Train schedules linked disparate offices across long distances. The paperwork trail thus became a map of priorities and influence. Some records emphasize logistics and machinery, while others stress morale and public narratives. The tension between operational detail and public framing seems intentional in certain releases. Official bulletins often adopted language that favors decisive action. Internal notes sometimes adopt a more cautious tone, perhaps reflecting uncertainty. This tonal divergence may indicate competing pressures within the administration. In some cases, marginal annotations reframe losses as temporary setbacks. In other cases, later stamps align a file with a different operational category. Such shifts might have been practical, or they could have reflected the needs of higher authorities. The repeated presence of folded memoranda in image sets suggests a culture of circulation beyond a single office. When a document circulated, it passed through several hands, each adding brief notations or initials. Those notations sometimes create layers of attribution that confuse later readers. The cumulative effect is a record that is rich in detail but ambiguous in provenance. Archivists have described these materials as both abundant and uneven. The physical state of the papers also matters. Some folders are brittle, edges darkened by handling. Others display clean impressions of file stamps that remain legible. Those sharp imprints can anchor a timeline when other evidence is murky. Conversely, smudged stamps or partially torn pages create interpretive gaps. In several collections, researchers encountered copies where the same photograph bears different captions. Those caption changes can alter perceived intent. They might appear to reframe scenes from operational necessity to morale purpose. The circulation of images and texts thus operated on parallel tracks. At the policy level, the way files were compiled likely shaped post-conflict reviews. Committees relied on those very stacks to draw lessons for future planning. If reference numbers were changed or dates adjusted, the basis for subsequent strategy could shift accordingly. That possibility matters because it connects archival practice to decision-making. Records that emphasize success may validate certain doctrines. Records that emphasize strain may provoke reform. The interplay between rhetoric and paperwork therefore shaped institutional memory. Families and communities were affected too. Pension claims and commemoration procedures often required specific file references. When reference numbers were altered, the bureaucratic path to recognition could become more complex. Plain coats and station photographs remind us of those civilian threads woven through institutional processes. The archival motif of a file stamp appears even in museum displays, where curators mount enlarged impressions beside faded photographs. Those exhibitions sometimes smooth contradictions, favoring coherent narratives over messy paperwork. The choices made by curators thus continue the chain of selection first enacted in offices. In archival practice, small edits can propagate into public stories. Even now, researchers must navigate folders that contain conflicting docket entries. Those entries occasionally carry pencil annotations that suggest later review or reclassification. The presence of such pencil marks may indicate either clerical correction or retrospective reframing. Either interpretation alters how the material is read today. Beyond written evidence, oral histories add nuance to the paper trail. Former clerks recall nights of hurried typing and split shifts. Their memories sometimes match the quirks in the four ledgers, and at other times they contradict official chronologies. Oral testimony often highlights human error, bureaucratic overload, and the uneven flow of information. That testimony can explain why a file stamp is inconsistent or why a reference number was later changed. At the same time, memory can be fallible, and interviews must be weighed against physical documents. The two sources together help to triangulate possible explanations. In short, the paper trail is not a single voice. It is a chorus of hands, stamps, annotations, and silences. The stacked folders, the folded memoranda, and the recurring image of the uniform lapel form a continuity across archives. Those motifs allow us to follow administrative practice through time. Yet the anomalies within those same motifs remind us that official accounts may not capture every motive. The records may preserve intention, or they may reflect later shaping for narrative ends. Either way, the papers matter because they formed the substrate for decisions that affected countless lives. They call us to examine not only what was ordered, but also how it was recorded and later remembered. Chapter 3. Images. From a managed front, photographs from the campaign present a studied calm that often feels rehearsed. Close-up portraits show faces set in steady expressions, each captured with careful lighting and frame. Wide archival crowd shots record columns of people and machines moving along open roads. Mid-shots of documents sit on desks beside inked annotations and a folded memorandum. Exterior transit shots show trains on platforms, engines quiet under gray skies. The variety of images implies many moments, yet their selection appears purposeful. Official releases emphasized order, resolve, and coordinated action in public statements. Other readings suggest those images might have been curated to soften perception of disorder. The contrast between staged groupings and scattered field. Notes suggests managed presentation. A duplicate print from separate collections carries different captions, which indicates later editorial choice. In some series, a captioned photograph bears a stamped date that does not match a related ledger entry. These two indicators do not prove coordinated manipulation, but they invite careful inquiry. The recurring motif of a file stamp appears across image sets. That stamp anchors documents to administrative processes even as images narrate broader themes. Uniform lapels appear in many portraits, linking individuals visually to institutional roles. Train platforms recur in exterior frames, connecting offices to supply and movement networks. The imagery often pairs a solemn portrait with an overhead. view of logistics. This pairing implies human presence at the center of larger machinery. The photographs thus operate on two levels. On one level, they document personnel and movement. On another level, they shape perception and meaning for audiences. Official texts accompany several images and frame events as decisive and necessary actions. Alternative interpretations often read those same texts as emphasis on continuity and image management. In multiple collections, mid-shots of tables stacked with folders appear beside neat captions. The folders carry visible impressions of file stamps and thumb marks from frequent handling. Those physical traces suggest circulation across rooms and departments. At times, a single face appears in several shots, always posed and often slightly turned toward light. That repetition can reinforce familiarity and implied authority. At the same time, candid portraits in other dossiers show a quieter fatigue. Those candid frames hint at lived strain rather than public assurance. In one set, a series of prints shows nearly identical arrangements, yet captions shift subtly. The small caption differences may alter interpretation from tactical necessity to symbolic expression. Similarly, a margin annotation in an attached report reframes a passage about supply lines. That annotation appears later in a different handwriting, suggesting either review or reclassification. Such changes can be mundane. They can also be meaningful when placed beside curated images. The interplay of image and annotation thus shapes both contemporary impression and later memory. Photographs of crowded platforms show civilians in plain coats watching trains pass. Their faces are not centered, yet they are present in many frames. The presence of civilians ties documentary images back to the daily consequences of decisions. A close-up of a folded memorandum might sit on a table next to a portrait. That juxtaposition links the human and the bureaucratic. It suggests that policy and paperwork moved in tandem with movement on the ground. Photographs of interiors show dim offices, stacks of folded memoranda, and hands turning pages. Those images make paperwork visible in ways that typical bulletins do not. They highlight process and procedure as parts of the wartime narrative. At times, images of public ceremonies appear highly composed. Banners and clipped newspaper headers are used as foreground motifs. These recurring elements create continuity across different releases and archives. They also suggest a deliberate, visual language meant to resonate with viewers. The language emphasizes resilience, resourcefulness, and unity. Alternative readings note that the same language can function to smooth controversy and align public expectations. Variations in captions and the presence of marginal notes point to evolving explanations during and after the events. Photographs of individuals in plain uniforms show both composure and weariness. Close-up shots reveal sequined dirt on collars and the crease of a uniform lapel. These small details convey human cost without explicit description. They anchor the images in lived experience rather than abstract claims. Wide shots of columns of machines show mechanical order and landscape interaction. Those frames emphasize scale, motion, and the visual rhythm of repeated forms. At the same time, mid-shots of scattered paraphernalia on fields provide counterpoints. These counterpoints suggest that not every scene matched the neatness presented in official sets. The curated selections of images may have served multiple audiences. Military staff could use some prints for internal planning. Press offices might distribute selected frames to newspapers and bulletins. Exhibitions could then choose images that fit broader narratives. The circulation path from office to public display shaped the way the events were remembered. Photographs often traveled with documents bearing file stamps and docket entries. The physical pairing of image and text created a composite record. Changes to captions or marginal annotations therefore affected both visual and documentary meaning. The presence of edited captions in later prints indicates interpretive shifts over time. Those shifts may have been pragmatic responses to new information, or they could reflect evolving rhetorical priorities. In either case, the visual record reveals layers of mediation between eyewitness moments and public memory. Black and white frames magnify contrasts of light and shadow. Monochrome images compress color into texture and tone, focusing attention on form and gesture. The reduction of color also enhances the sense of historical distance. Viewers thus receive images as artifacts as much as evidence. That double status complicates simple readings. It also invites viewers to consider what is shown and what is omitted. In several image sets, a recurring motif appears: the file stamp placed near a photograph. This repetition ties the visual record back to archiving systems. The file stamp functions as both locator and seal. It anchors images to bureaucratic process while signaling official custody. The folded memorandum likewise appears in many frames, either physically or referenced in captions. That document motif emphasizes the administrative scaffolding behind operations. Train platform imagery returns frequently as well. These exterior transit shots link homefront movement to institutional centers. They suggest the constant flow of people and material that sustained distant operations. Small human moments occur within these patterns. A hand holds a letter. A group shares a brief conversation beneath a platform awning. A face turns toward a departing engine. Such moments punctuate grander visual themes and remind viewers of personal stakes. The curated record ultimately shaped later exhibitions and textbooks. Museums sometimes reproduce selected frames, enlarging file stamps and captions for emphasis. Those curatorial choices shape the narrative made accessible to wider audiences. If captions are altered or marginal notes omitted, the resulting presentation may simplify complex archives. Historians and archivists therefore continue to debate selection criteria. They examine duplicated prints and catalog entries to trace provenance. When a caption shifts between editions, scholars note the change and ask why. When a margin note reclassifies a photograph, researchers likewise probe intent. These practices show how image curation remains an ongoing site of interpretation. In the end, the visual archive is not merely a record of events. It is an active medium through which meaning was shaped, contested, and propagated. The tension between stage presentation and candid documentation persists in the frames. The presence of inconsistent captions and later annotations hints at contested narratives. The motif of the file stamp, the folded memorandum, the uniform lapel, and the train platform weaves through these images. These recurring elements create continuity. They also remind us that images were part of a larger administrative and rhetorical process. The next chapter will move from images toward the halls of institutional review and official narrative shaping. Chapter 4: Institutional Narratives. Under quiet review committees met in tall buildings after the fighting, poring over maps and ledgers with steady motions. The rooms smelled of paper and lamp oil. Men in plain uniforms and officials in civilian coats gathered around long tables. They read aloud from folded memoranda and compared entries line by line. Staff moved stacks of files with visible file stamps. The meetings were meant to make sense of complex operations. The stated aim often sought to extract lessons useful for future planning. Other explanations suggest the reviews may also have been intended to produce a single coherent narrative. Those competing pressures shape the tone of minutes and formal summaries. Pages sometimes bear changed reference numbers that reassign responsibility among departments. A stamped date on a memorandum occasionally conflicts with a ledger entry, indicating revisions made after initial circulation. Such anomalies neither prove intent nor fully explain motives. They do, however, point to an administrative process that could be both corrective and selective. Evidence appears in marginal notes in short initials placed beside paragraphs and in penciled amendments on minutes. Committees reference these marks when drafting subsequent reports. The reports then moved outward to press rooms, exhibition planners, and other institutional venues. This flow illustrates how archival practice travels from internal review to public presentation. The institutional voice typically favored confident language. Reports described decisions as necessary and outcomes as instructive. Alternative readings, however, note a different, more cautious register in internal correspondence. Where public texts asserted clarity, internal notes often recorded uncertainty and resource strain. That divergence suggests the presence of multiple audiences. Officials had to satisfy both operational commanders and broader political expectations. The resulting documents therefore balance technical assessment with rhetorical framing. In several collections, a long memorandum was circulated, folded and refolded, carrying finger smudges from frequent handling. That memo appears in different archives with slightly different headings. These heading shifts may reflect practical filing, or they might indicate later editorial choices. Either interpretation matters because headings influence the way later readers perceive priority and causation. Committees worked from layered sources. They had access to field reports, logistical ledgers, medical summaries, and public communiques. Each source brought its own emphasis. Field reports stressed immediate constraints. Logistic ledgers focused on movement and supply. Public communiques emphasized morale and unity. Reconciling these sources required judgment, and judgment introduces interpretation. Interpretation can highlight some facts while rendering others marginal. The procedural language of minutes therefore shaped memory. Where a docket entry shifted classification, the downstream effect could be substantial. A reclassified file might alter the eligibility for certain benefits later, or it could change the official record of who authorized an action. Such bureaucratic shifts had human consequences. Families seeking recognition or reparations depended on stable references. When the reference numbers in a series of papers were altered, claimants sometimes faced longer delays. The same archival adjustments could also affect scholarly reading generations later. Researchers encountering cross-referenced files must decide which version best represents original intent. The presence of later hand edits thus complicates straightforward interpretation. The institutional review process also involved presentations and curated exhibitions. Committees recommended which photographs and documents to display. The selections often favored images that matched formal conclusions. That curatorial filtering might have been practical. Institutions prefer coherent stories for public consumption. It might also have been strategic. Choosing particular frames and captions can reinforce a desired meaning. Exhibits mounted in monochrome emphasized certain motifs. File stamps enlarged beside portraits, folded memoranda displayed under glass, and uniform lapels captured in close-up. Those motifs reinforced the institutional archive as tangible evidence. At the same time, they guided collective memory towards certain themes. The choice to emphasize endurance, planning, or sacrifice shaped civic narratives. Alternative explanations note that these choices could also downplay dissent, missteps, or uncertainty. Committees sometimes annotated reports with proposed phrasing for public release. Those proposed phrasings can appear later, inserted in transcripts or added to captions. Such insertions point to an active editorial process in which institutional voices calibrated messages. The calibration process balanced operational transparency with political stability. It also aimed to preserve morale while meeting legal and administrative obligations. The balancing act sometimes produced language that seems measured and other times language that reads as protective. Reviews conducted by committees therefore served multiple masters. They sought to learn practical lessons. They also sought to shape legacy and assign responsibility. The very act of assigning responsibility involved choices about emphasis and omission. When a marginal note redirects a paragraph, it can alter the impression of accountability. The change might simply reflect new information. It might also reflect pressure from higher authorities. Determining which is which often requires careful archival comparison. That work can reveal patterns. In some collections, similar edits appear across multiple files, suggesting coordinated revision. In other collections, edits are isolated, indicating local correction. Both situations have implications for how institutional memory forms. The human dimension of institutional review also shows in routine details. Clerks logged arrivals at train platforms and stamped delivery receipts. Officers wrote brief summaries on folded papers late into the night. Families waited at platforms for confirmation or for news. Those everyday practices bound administrative procedure to personal consequence. When committees debated policy recommendations, they considered logistics and public reception alike. Some proposals focused on technical fixes. Others addressed training, leadership, and public communication. The resulting recommendations shaped budgets and organizational priorities. Over time, those changes affected the career paths of officers, the distribution of equipment, and the terms of commemoration. Institutional narratives thus had material effects on how future decisions were taken. The archives also show how language evolved across drafts. Early minutes sometimes read as tentative. Later circulars often adopt definitive phrasing. The IT shift from tentative to certain can be traced in sequences of drafts carrying successive file stamps. That pattern may reflect natural clarification as more facts became available. It may also reflect institutional needs to close debate and present a unified line. The motives likely included both elements. Historians must therefore read drafts carefully, noting where dates or reference numbers shift. Those small indicators are often the key to understanding the trajectory of collective memory. The recurrence of certain motifs across files helps to map institutional intent. The file stamp appears as a stabilizing sign. The folded memorandum signals circulation and repeated consultation. The uniform lapel in portraits links people to roles and responsibilities. The train platform imagery connects administrative decision, making with movement on the ground. Together, these motifs form a visual and textual grammar that institutions use to speak about the past. Yet the grammar also conceals decisions about relevance and emphasis. The institutional review process thus becomes a study of both answer and omission. The documents that survive tell partial stories, shaped by procedural needs and rhetorical choices. They invite scrutiny precisely because they shaped public narratives and policy in the years that followed. The next chapter will turn from institutional records to the ways those narratives were exhibited, taught, and remembered in later decades. Chapter 5. Echoes. In contemporary memory, decades later, the clash remains present in public spaces and private recollection. Museums mount monochrome displays with enlarged file stamps and clipped headlines. Schoolrooms use framed prints and folded memoranda to anchor lessons in civic duty. Families visit memorial halls wearing plain coats and small badge replicas. Community ceremonies often feature biographies read aloud in steady voices. Official narratives emphasize sacrifice, continuity, and national perseverance. Alternative. Readings suggest memory may also serve contemporary identity projects. Exhibits sometimes streamline complex records into simplified captions designed for broad audiences. Some display captions show dates at odds with the documents beside them. One exhibit uses a cropped image where original context is missing. These two mismatches do not necessarily prove manipulation. They do indicate how selection and presentation shape understanding. The repeated motif of the uniform lapel appears in textbooks and plaques. Photographs of train platforms remain a frequent visual shorthand. The file stamp and the folded memorandum are often displayed together under glass. That pairing links archival process to public meaning. Archives and curators face choices about which materials to highlight. They balance educational goals with conservation constraints and donor preferences. Curatorial choices influence how generations perceive contested events. Teachers select images that fit curricular aims and local sensibilities. Museums often rely on donations whose provenance may be partial or unclear. Donor histories can shape exhibit narratives in subtle ways. The path from field report to school text often involves intermediary edits. Editors and curators adapt language and imagery to contemporary audiences. In doing so, they may remove ambiguity or obscure contradiction. The resulting presentations can appear coherent even when underlying files suggest complexity. Public speeches frequently adopt definitive phrasing. Commemorative rhetoric tends to favor clarity and moral framing. That rhetorical clarity can sidestep procedural nuance recorded in ledgers. The ledgers often contain penciled annotations that hint at contingency. Those marginal notes may have served immediate administrative needs. They may also indicate later reclassification or reassessment. Pension offices and legal processes rely on stable reference numbers. When numbers shift, the bureaucratic path to recognition can become longer. Families seeking acknowledgement sometimes encounter doors closed by archival ambiguity. The policy consequences of archival practice are tangible and long-lasting. Decisions made in office rooms decades earlier can influence entitlement outcomes. Today, institutional memory therefore operates at the intersection of sentiment and statute. Public displays mediate both. Commemoration ceremonies create a temporal bridge between past and present. They connect personal stories to national narratives. Yet the selection of stories can privilege certain perspectives. Those choices reflect social priorities and political climates at the time of curation. As political contexts change, so too can the emphasis of exhibitions. A document once framed as proof of operational success might later be reinterpreted as evidence of systemic strain. Such shifts reflect evolving scholarly consensus and shifting public values. Digital archives add a new layer of complexity and access. Scanned folders make large corpora available to distant researchers. Digital collections increase transparency, but also introduce choices about metadata and framing. Search terms, captions, and thumbnails can guide interpretation. Algorithms may rank items based on engagement rather than historical relevance. That dynamic could privilege dramatic images over mundane but meaningful documents. The interplay between digital access and curatorial direction thus reshapes public history. Oral histories complement written records and images. Veterans and family members contribute memories that resist tidy categorization. Their recollections sometimes confirm archival notes and at other times diverge. Oral testimony can highlight human routines behind abstract entries in ledgers. Personal narratives reveal how ceremonies, trains, and memos intersected with daily life. Those narratives emphasize the texture of waiting, the quiet work of clerks, and the small acts that sustained communities. Memory projects often seek to reconcile documentary gaps with lived experience. Scholars use triangulation to compare ledgers, photographs, and interviews. This method can surface consistencies and contradictions alike. It can also reveal how language shifted across drafts and editions. The recurrence of the file stamp across contexts helps anchor timelines. Yet the presence of later hand edits complicates authorship and timing. The two indicators cited earlier reflect this broader pattern of selection and recontextualization. Academic debates continue about intent and emphasis in archival practices. Some historians argue for pragmatic explanations, such as haste and resource strain. Others point to coordinated editorial processes intended to produce a coherent public line. Both views may contain elements of truth. The resulting discourse informs museum practice and classroom pedagogy. Contemporary policy discussions reference archival interpretations when framing lessons for officials and citizens. Rhetorical frames developed in exhibits sometimes feed into public education campaigns. That loop can normalize particular understandings while excluding alternative perspectives. Civic rituals therefore participate in shaping future policy priorities. Moreover, international contexts influence memorialization choices. Diplomatic relations and comparative histories affect which narratives are amplified. Cross-border exhibitions might emphasize shared suffering and cooperation. Domestic displays may privilege sovereignty and national resilience. These differing emphases demonstrate how memory intertwines with present interests. Cultural producers, such as filmmakers and authors, draw upon archival motifs to craft narratives. They use the uniform lapel and the train platform to evoke era and mood. Their creative works can amplify certain readings and obscure others. The circulation of images into popular culture thus extends archival influence beyond institutional walls. As time passes, new questions arise about the ethics of display and the responsibilities of custodians. Should curators present every contradiction and ambiguity? Or should they contextualize selected materials for clarity and pedagogy? There are no easy answers. Many practitioners aim for layered presentations that acknowledge uncertainty while offering interpretive frames. They include notes about provenance, editorial changes, and contested captions. Such transparency helps audiences appreciate complexity. It also foregrounds how institutional practices shaped public memory. The persistence of motifs like the file stamp and the folded memorandum helps audiences trace continuities across decades. These motifs serve as visual anchors in exhibitions and texts. They remind viewers that administrative processes and human stories intersect in sustained ways. The balance between honoring sacrifice and interrogating narratives remains delicate. Memory work thus involves both commemoration and critical inquiry. That dual mandate invites ongoing engagement. The story remains open and contested. Future displays, research, and public conversations will continue to test which meanings endure. The chapter closes by noting that memory is an active process. It is made and remade by choices about selection, captioning, and emphasis. Those choices carry consequences for policy, families, and civic identity. The next step is to ask how communities and institutions will handle the ongoing responsibility to remember while remaining honest about uncertainty. Years of curation and debate have layered meaning over these monochrome traces. Museums, schools, and families repeated motifs to shape public understanding. The file stamp appears in gallery labels and academic footnotes alike. Folded memoranda sit beneath glass, their edges softened by frequent handling. Train platforms remain a favored image for linking home and state. The uniform lapel returns in portraits that bridge private and institutional memory. These repeated elements provide continuity across generations and archives. Yet gaps and edits persist within the surviving papers and prints. Some captions shift between editions, suggesting changing emphasis over time. Marginal notes sometimes reclassify documents, which could alter later interpretation. Such subtleties do not erase lived experience. They do, however, complicate how communities assign meaning and responsibility. The human consequences are plain, even in monochrome. Families sought recognition through shifting bureaucratic references. Curatorial choices affected legal paths and social recognition. Digital access now enlarges audiences and accelerates reinterpretation. Scanned folders and searchable indexes make contradictions visible to more researchers. At the same time, metadata, choices and thumbnail images may privilege particular narratives. Oral histories continue to complicate tidy accounts. Testimony often confirms paperwork and occasionally challenges official chronologies. The interplay of documents, images, and memory suggests layered truth rather than single answers. Future exhibitions might foreground uncertainty alongside commemoration. Scholars may produce new readings as more archives open to review. Communities will likely continue to balance honor with inquiry, and schools may revise narratives accordingly. The story remains incomplete and worth revisiting with care. How will curators, educators, and families negotiate these tensions next? The answer may shape public memory for generations yet to come.